Yours.
Okay, so today we're going to talk about the core and just introduce a little bit of a new way of looking at it. Again, like Matt said, if you just came on and didn't hear him, if you have any questions as we go, you can add them to the Q&A or the chat section on the bottom of the screen. Matt's going to be running it, so he'll stop me if there are any questions that are pressing during the presentation, or we'll get to them at the end as well. And then I'll have a few little points in the middle where I'll ask Matt if there are any questions. And he also mentioned that if you do have a yoga mat close by, or even a little bit of space on the floor, there's nothing super strenuous that we're doing. I just have 3 little exercises that you can try to incorporate some of the concepts that we're going to go over through the presentation. Okay, so let's get started. So just to start, a little bit about me. My name's Katja. Just kind of going back, way back when, I grew up in a small town called Baxter. No one's ever heard of it, so I just put that as outside of Barrie, Ontario, because most people have heard of Barrie. But I'm currently living in Toronto. I did my undergrad at U of T, and I graduated with a bachelor's of kinesiology, and worked as a kin for about a year before deciding to pursue physiotherapy. From there, I went to do my master's in physio at Oxford Brookes University in Oxford, England. So I got to live in England for a couple of years, which is pretty cool. And both my mom and sister are physios, and I attended physio school with one of my cousins. So we're a big family of physios, and some of them are watching, so shout out to them. And then once I came back to Toronto from Oxford, I started working in Toronto, and then I specialized in pelvic floor physiotherapy. Obviously I'm going to tie it a little bit into today's presentation, but there's a lot that goes into pelvic floor physio. So if you have any specific questions about anything I don't go over today regarding pelvic floor physio, you can always contact me afterwards. I'll have my contact details at the end of the presentation for you guys. And so my hobbies, just hanging out with friends and family, obviously pre-quarantine, can't do that anymore. And then exercising and playing soccer. All right, so just getting started with the presentation. So just some objectives. We're just gonna review the function of the core muscles and the function of the pelvic floor, and go into kind of how those two relate, especially because even before I did my courses, I never really considered the pelvic floor at all when I was exercising. So sort of giving you guys some ideas on how you can incorporate it. And then, yeah, new concepts to consider when you're doing your core activities. And then at the end, like I said, I'll give you guys some exercises to try, and then we'll incorporate some of the concepts we go over today. All right, so have some fun memes for you guys, because everyone loves memes. The functions of the core muscle is pretty simple. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about those muscles, right? The core muscles. So they contain and protect your internal organs. They increase the mobility of the spine through flexion, which is bending forward. So if you think about a crunch, extension, bending backwards, if anyone ever does Superman's, rotation, those are your oblique muscles, and then side flexion, which is side bending. And then it controls the pelvic lumbar relationship. So that relationship between your pelvis, your low back, and kind of mid spine, right? That whole area is kind of considered your core. And then the functions of the pelvic floor. So there's 5 functions. Oftentimes people have no idea that it does so much, but it does. So it's a kind of a cool band of muscles. So the most common function that people know of is that it helps to control your bladder and your bowels, right? So it's the muscles that we use when we really have to pee, those muscles that you can think of that you have to squeeze. And the second function is similar to the abdominal muscles. It supports your pelvic organs, right? So it has that support function. The third function is stability. So this is what we're going to be focusing most on today. It's a really important function. When the pelvic floor contracts, the core muscles co-contract. So those deep core muscles and your hip muscles co-contract. So that already kind of tells you why the pelvic floor might be important when we're doing core activities. like I said, I never even thought of incorporating pelvic floor when I was doing my core activities before, or my core exercises before I did my courses. But this will hopefully give you guys a new tool to use to enhance your core strategy, your core strength, and your efficiency. The fourth function is the pelvic floor aids in both male and female sexual function. And then the last one is that it helps to pump blood and lymphatic tissue up to the heart. So just like your calves do when you're walking, it has that sump-pump function to get those fluids moving back up towards the heart. All right. Okay, so as I briefly mentioned before, studies have shown that when the pelvic floor contracts, your deep abdominal muscles co-contract. So again, if we want our abdominal muscles to get stronger and more efficient, why are we not incorporating the pelvic floor? So if you think about a squat, you want your glutes, your hip flexors, your hamstrings, your quads, everything to kind of work together to perform the most efficient movement. We should also incorporate this into our core practice. We want that whole system to work together. So I want everyone to start thinking about their core as a container. So the front of the container kind of being your abdominal muscles, right? The back of the container is your spinal muscles or your back muscles. The top is your diaphragm, right? So that big breathing muscle that we use to expand our lungs. And then the bottom is your pelvic floor. So front, back, top, bottom, right? So it kind of creates this whole container system. So if you think about if you take your lunch to work or school and you don't want that top or bottom of the container missing, right? Or else that container is not going to support your food. So same idea for your core. If we can get all those layers of that container functioning together, we're going to be a more efficient system. So next, kind of as the slide says, I'm going to introduce a concept called the piston. This is how we start to incorporate the pelvic floor into our core practice to help recreate a new strategy, which will help our core to perform more efficiently. Right, so the piston. So there's two muscles involved in the piston, the diaphragm and the pelvic floor. So that top and the bottom of the container, like I was talking about before. So if you kind of picture them sitting on top of each other like this, right? So as we inhale, our diaphragm contracts and pulls down and creates more space in our lungs, right? So the diaphragm is pulling down, and what that causes the pelvic floor to do is to lengthen and relax, right? So they move in the same direction. As we exhale, the diaphragm recoils and pulls back up, and that's when our pelvic floor is able to contract properly, right? So that's when it's most efficient at contracting, is when the diaphragm pulls up on our exhale. So you can kind of see in those photos I have on the slide, as your diaphragm pulls down, the pelvic floor pulls down on your inhale, and then your exhale, they both move back in the same direction. So thinking about how a piston works, they work in the same direction, right? They're kind of moving down and then back up together. So if these two muscles are working as a proper piston, then you're going to be balancing out the pressure system nicely, right? So if you kind of look between those two muscles on the photos, you see sort of that lined object that's kind of mimicking pressure in the system. So as the two go down, that pressure stays the same, right? Because that space between the two muscles is remaining the same. So we're going to talk a little bit about that pressure system. So again, like I said, the piston between our diaphragm and our pelvic floor create that pressure system in our abdominal cavity. And if they work in the same direction, that pressure system is normalized or optimized, right? If the diaphragm were to pull down and you tried to do a pelvic floor contraction, you're just increasing that pressure within the abdominals, right? Because you're kind of like squishing the two muscles towards each other, which means that the two systems are just working against each other. So we want to make sure that the pressure inside the abdominal cavity is appropriately balanced in our bodies to make our muscles perform most efficiently. That's why it's important to use your breath when you're incorporating pelvic floor into activity, because these two muscles work so closely together, right? Breath is important regardless, but especially when we're incorporating pelvic floor. So if we're working to engage our pelvic floor during exercises, we need to incorporate the breath, right? The two go hand in hand. They don't work separately, they work completely together. So we're going to kind of go over what happens when that pressure system fails, right? When we try to do two things against each other. So have you guys, like, I'm sure most of you have been told, if you've been instructed to do a core exercise before, or you've heard somebody say this before, is like pull your belly button to your spine, flatten your back against the ground, tighten your core muscles, like tense everything, activate your core. What's happening to your abdominals when we do this, right? What's going on inside of our system when we just like tense everything? So this causes us to grip through our abdominals, and oftentimes it creates a breath hold or a partial breath, right? Therefore, we're not releasing the pressure out of our system, and our piston can't function properly. So you see tons of people doing this at the gym, right? Like when we start to fatigue, we start to hold our breath, or even just when we're doing like a heavy lift or whatever it is, right? We start to hold our breath. People go red in the face and they look like they're going to explode. This is not good for our system, right? My boyfriend's probably laughing and rolling his eyes because constantly when we're at the gym, I'm telling him to exhale because he has a bad habit of holding his breath when he's bench pressing or squatting. It just puts a lot of pressure inside of our system. And as we hold our breath, the pressure is staying in that abdominal cavity. It has to go somewhere. And if we're not releasing it through our exhale, where does it go? All right. So risks of breath holding. So it's kind of threefold, right? You can kind of add a few more things here and there, but these are the three main ones. There's an increased load on your abdominal wall, right? So you have a band of tissue that sits, I'm not going to go too much into anatomy, but there's a band of tissue that sits between your six-pack muscles, right? So if you think about your six-pack muscles sit like this, I guess this would be six. There's a band of tissue that sits in between them, and it's a thin layer of tissue, right? If we're like holding all that pressure inside of our abdominal cavity, that pressure is pushing out onto that linea alba, that band of tissue, right? And it's not as strong as muscle. So if we're putting this extra pressure on these tissues, it's going to compromise the abdominals and decrease their ability to stabilize, right? So these muscles can't engage properly if we're just like tensing everything. Then we have increased load on the pelvic floor. So a little bit of like, because male and females have different pelvic anatomy, there's a little bit more of a risk for females in this case, but both for males and females. But if we're going to be like breath holding and increasing pressure and like putting pressure through our pelvic floor over years and years or time after time, there's a bit of an increased risk of prolapse, right? Which is basically where the pelvic organs prolapse into, for women, it would be the vaginal cavity. And it just weakens off the pelvic floor, right? It doesn't allow the pelvic floor to function properly, doesn't allow the pelvic floor to contract properly. Think about like pressure being pushed down the pelvic floor and the pelvic floor is trying to contract. Over time, it's just going to weaken off and it's not going to be able to hold anymore. And then we get over and under recruitment of muscles, right? So if our strategy is to breath hold when performing core exercises, we tend to over and under recruit other muscles. So we might be overusing our back muscles, underusing our abdominals, or overusing our hip flexors and underusing our glutes, right? That container, going back to that container, it's not able to function properly if we hold our breath. So we're losing that top and bottom, right? And everything else is having to like overwork for two muscles that are normally should be able to function quite easily, right? So how do we fix this, right? How do we get out of that habit of like constantly holding our breath or constantly tensing, right? We think about how often you're planking and you're just like holding everything in and everything. And are you able to breathe properly? No, right? Because that lower rib cage can't expand. Okay, so optimizing the core. So how do we optimize this entire system and avoid putting too much pressure into that abdominal cavity? So pretty simple. It's simple and easy to fix, but easy to forget, right? So, but we just need to start incorporating the breath and the pelvic floor into our core exercises. Soon as we start being conscious of our breath, things go a little bit easier. So again, if we think about it as a piston, the breath comes a lot easier. It's going to require you to slow the movement down, but by slowing movements down and slowing exercises down, that actually challenges our system a lot more. So you're going to become a lot stronger from it, right? Studies show that if we go slower through a movement and we're conscious about a movement and we're doing it properly, that strength, that proper strength is going to be built a little bit better than if we're just like banging through reps and we're just trying to get things done as fast as we can. Okay, so 3 tips that you can kind of remember to optimize your core is to blow before you go, right? Exhale on exertion. It doesn't just have to be with your core exercises. This should be adapted through all your exercises, right? Exhale on exertion. So say you're bench pressing, right? As you come down and you're about to push up, that's when you want to exhale, right? Release that pressure, allow those muscles to function properly. Squats, all that kind of stuff. This can be incorporated through like the entire spectrum of us exercising. Okay, so the next one is to contract your pelvic floor when you exhale. Remember that piston, right? As we exhale, the pelvic floor is a bit easier to contract, right? On our inhale, we want it to relax. Exhale is contracting. So we never really want to contract our pelvic floor on our inhale because that's just like not allowing that piston to function properly.
So Katja, we got a question here.
Yeah.
Somebody's asking, how do they know if they're contracting the pelvic floor properly? Is there a cue they can use that they know they're going to feel it properly?
Yeah, we're going to go over it.
Perfect. Okay.
Is there any other questions before I keep going?
No, that's the only question right now.
Okay. And then the last thing is to reset on your inhale, right? Your inhale's there for a reason. It helps you kind of like reset, relax, and prep for the next rep. So it's there to help set you up for success, right? It gives you that ability to engage your piston. If we don't inhale, we can't exhale, right? So we need kind of both systems they're both important. Okay, so this is where your yoga mat comes in handy. So I'm gonna give everyone like a couple seconds to situate yourself on a mat. I'm gonna quickly give some cues, going back to the question that was just asked, on how to engage your pelvic floor. So that way when I say contract your pelvic floor, you know what I mean. So essentially, a really easy way to think about it is those muscles, like if you really have to pee, those muscles that you squeeze, right? It's not like squeezing your core, squeezing your glutes, it's not squeezing everything, just the muscles that sit in your pelvic floor, right? So another way to kind of think about it is from the area that you pee, if you think of marble sitting there and you're trying to squeeze and lift it up inside, right? So those small band of muscles that sit right underneath your pelvis, okay? So, Matt, any other questions before I keep going?
Simona had a question, similar question. So I think she's looking for clarification here. So she's asking, so we have to exhale and contract the pelvic floor on exertion?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So again, this bridge pose will give you like the exact instructions on how to do that. So we'll go over that now. So if you have your yoga mat, I'm going to get you to lay on your back for me. And all I want you to do is, most people have done this exercise before. Again, if you have any injuries or not able to do these exercises, please don't do them. Don't hurt yourself. But if you've done this before and you know you're okay with it, then all I want you to do is just lift your hips and feel what muscles are working, right? Don't think about your pelvic floor. Don't think about anything for a second. I just want you to feel what's working. So is it your quads? Is it your core? Is it your glutes? Is it your hamstrings? Is it your back? Like, what do you feel is most working? And then once you've done that, come back down and lay on your back again. We're going to do another one, but this is where we incorporate the piston pelvic floor analogy. So now I want you to take a big deep breath in, and then on your exhale, you're going to engage your pelvic floor and you're going to lift your hips. So there's like 3 movements that kind of go in one, right? The exhale, pelvic floor, lift your hips, all happen in one movement. You should feel on the one where you're engaging your pelvic floor that your glutes engage way better than they did previously when you weren't engaging your pelvic floor. So you can kind of give that a go again if you want to do one without a pelvic floor contraction and then one with. Your glutes will probably engage much better when you engage your pelvic floor, right? Because they co-contract with your hip muscles. Okay, so I'll give you guys a second to try that. I see the little thing blinking. Matt, are we still good for questions?
Just again, maybe at the end we can just re-clarify about contracting the pelvic floor,
Yeah.
or maybe even with this next exercise, because there just seems to be a lot of questions about that.
Okay. So maybe I'll just quickly go over it again. So it's hard when someone's just telling you over a screen how to contract your pelvic floor, but all I want you to do is do it with your exhale, right? So when you're on your back, take a big deep breath in, and then I want you to, as if you're trying to stop yourself from peeing, squeeze those muscles, right? On your exhale, and then let that go, right? It shouldn't feel like this massive contraction. It just should feel like a very minimal contraction. And again, if anyone has like pelvic floor dysfunction, sometimes if people have had children, there's a lot of times where it's difficult if we've never really incorporated the pelvic floor to actually feel it contract. It's the same thing when people say, I can't feel my glutes contracting, right? Sometimes we have weakness in that muscle and it's difficult to feel.
We definitely have some people noticing different engagement in their glutes with that exercise.
Cool.
Somebody's asking about the difference between this and a Kegel.
So a Kegel is just a term for a pelvic floor contraction. Same thing.
There we go.
But
Perfect.
a lot of people will do Kegels and not do it properly, right? Because they're not engaged, they're going against their breath and they're doing it in certain positions that they shouldn't be doing it in, or they use like weights and strange things. So I would say to start off for pelvic floor contractions, if you can do it with your breath, then you're essentially doing a Kegel, right? But you're doing it in the proper way. All right. Are we ready to move on?
Yeah, I think we're ready for the next one.
Good. Okay, so next one is an abdominal exercise. So if you guys kind of look at the screen, you can get an idea of where we're going with this. So again, we're going back to how a lot of times people are told to like press their back into the ground when they're doing any type of like leg lifts or abdominal crunches. So as mentioned before, what I want you to do is, as you're laying on the ground, rather than pressing your back into the ground, I want you to try to find a neutral pelvis. So you're going to really try to like arch your back, and then you're going to press it down, and you're going to rock back and forth through that motion. So your feet are on the ground right now, and let it arch. And what I want you to do is try to find what for you feels like neutral. So it shouldn't be that your back is completely arched, and it shouldn't be that your back is completely pressed down. Try to find that middle ground where you still feel like you can take a really good breath. Okay. So from here, you're going to bring both shins into the air, and then you're going to take an inhale, tap one foot down, exhale, contract your pelvic floor and lift your foot back up. Okay. You should feel like your deep core muscles are really engaging nicely. If you don't, then you need to extend your foot a little bit further away from your body. It's probably just too easy for you. Or if you're extending too far away and you feel like you're losing control, then bring your foot in a little closer. So your exhale and pelvic floor contraction happen when you're lifting your foot back up.
Can you just go over those steps? Can you go over those steps one more time for everybody?
Yeah. So feet are in the air. You found that neutral pelvis. Then you're going to inhale, tap your foot down, exhale, contract your pelvic floor to lift your foot back up. So it's a lot slower than you'd probably normally go when you do core exercises. We're trying to just like get in all the reps that we can. So it's going to feel really slow, right? But try to feel as though to see if your deep core muscles or the lower abdominals are working nicely. Make sure you breathe. Okay.
Great. And how's everybody feeling with that exercise? Everybody wants to, some people are feeling good. Some people want you to go through it one more time.
Okay. So
it's nice and
laying on your back. Okay. Laying on your back, you find that neutral pelvis, right? Just really make sure you're rocking your pelvis forward and backwards. Press your low back into the ground, then arch your back, come to that neutral ground. Whatever feels kind of normal for you. So it's different for everyone. Then bring your shins into the air, similar to picture one. Then you're going to take a nice big inhale. As you inhale, you're tapping your foot down. Okay. Then you exhale, contract your pelvic floor to lift your foot back up. You can play around with how far your foot is tapping out. Mine's kind of staying at 90 degrees in my photo. You can extend your foot all the way out if you're really used to doing core exercises. Whatever works, as long as you're not losing control, right? Cool. We good?
Yeah. So we got some people saying they're feeling it in their abs. Is that normal?
Yes, that's where you should feel it. Because that's causing those deep core muscles to co-contract, right? When you engage your pelvic floor, you automatically engage your deep core muscles.
Awesome. What do we have next?
Okay, cool. So last one, it's just really simple, an abdominal crunch. So again, lay on your back, find that neutral pelvis. Don't press your back into the ground, right? Find whatever feels neutral for you. Take a big deep breath in, you're just gonna relax. Then same idea, exhale, contract your pelvic floor, lift your head and your shoulders. Again, you should feel that like deeper, stronger contraction in your core. And you can play around with like not engaging your pelvic floor, lifting and feeling the difference between both. You should feel like a little bit of a stronger contraction as you engage your pelvic floor and lift your head and shoulders on your exhale. We need to go through it again.
Let's do one more time.
Okay, so again, you're on your back, finding that neutral pelvis. You are taking a nice deep breath in, exhale, squeeze pelvic floor, contract pelvic floor, lift your head and shoulders, inhale to come back down, right? And then you go exhale, contract pelvic floor, lift your head and shoulders. Engage that piston that we've been talking about. Cool?
Yeah, just having some people comment that they're definitely feel the difference between the two, how it felt a little bit deeper.
These are the things that get me excited.
Yeah. Somebody even mentioned they can actually do a little bit, like get a little bit more range of motion with their crunch, doing it this way as well, which is great.
Awesome. Cool. And again, if you've never engaged your pelvic floor before, don't be surprised if you can't really feel it engaging. That's not an uncommon thing, right? So it's either, there's a few reasons for why that could be happening. I could rant on for another half hour about that, but just kind of keep trying it. It's a bit of a brain, like a mind-body connection thing, right? So we just need to start sending those signals down to our pelvic floor to start telling our brain that it's even there, right? Because we never really think about that area of our body. All right, you okay to move on?
Yeah, let's move on.
Okay, so kind of just wrapping things up. So some of the key takeaways, I know it's a little bit of a new concept and it's kind of difficult to comprehend, but really, if anything that you're gonna take away these concepts. So no more breath holding. Be conscious of how you're executing certain exercises. I think a lot of the time we rush through things and try to get in as many reps as we can, when in reality it's just putting a lot of pressure inside of our system and we end up compensating and creating poor mechanics, right? So make sure you exhale. No more ab gripping. So when we grip our abs, for example, in a plank, it doesn't allow our diaphragm to have a proper range of motion. So your abdominals will still do their job, even if we don't like hold our core as tight as we possibly can, right? Allow yourself to breathe properly. It will be in your benefit, I promise you. And then thinking about that container, right? We don't want to take our lunch to work or to school that's missing a lid or a bottom, right? So think about that when you're doing abdominals. We want everything to work together. It's going to create a much more like stable, strong, and efficient mechanism. Use this analogy to develop a new core strategy for yourself, right? Start to incorporate your pelvic floor and your breath in exercises that you're doing. And then eventually it'll just become habit, right? As everything else is. You don't have to think about it as hard when you're doing it. And then not just taking these concepts away for pelvic floor, for your core exercises. They're important, like breath and pelvic floor are important in everything that we're doing, right? Squatting, bench press, shoulder press, single leg squat, lunges, skipping, all of those things we need to incorporate our breath and our core and our pelvic floor, right? So if we aren't breathing and releasing that pressure, it has to go somewhere else. And therefore the pelvic floor and abdominals just become compromised, right? We use our core for everything we do. We might as well make it the best we possibly can. And again, I kind of mentioned this before, but if you have any pelvic floor dysfunction, for example, like incontinence, prolapse, pelvic pain, please like consult a pelvic floor physio or someone before trying these concepts, just to make sure they're appropriate for you. It's like not always for everyone. It's like very general tips that I'm giving right now. And there's much more like complexity to all of this stuff, but it's just better to get things checked out and get the okay before trying them. And yeah, if it was a pretty simple, quick explanation for like a very complicated system that has a lot of different components. So I've added my email and my Instagram if you wanted to reach out and get in touch about any other questions that you can think of after the presentation. Or if Matt has any now, I'll go over them now. But yeah, thanks for listening and joining in.
That was great, Katja. And we've already got a bunch of questions coming in. Somebody's asked if you can explain the plank again and what not to do.
So
how to do it properly.
So really simple. You're going to do the same position as you normally would do, but just don't hold your breath, right? I think, or no more ab gripping, right? Like I was even guilty of it before. I would just like grip everything and tighten my core as tight as I possibly can, because that's just what I've been told for years. And that just doesn't allow our diaphragm to move properly, right? And that pressure just sits inside of our abdominal cavity. So just allow yourself to take normal breaths. The abs are still working when you do that. You don't have to just grip everything and tense everything.
Right. Thanks for that question, Morgan. We've got a question about how best to breathe and engage the pelvic floor while running.
Oh, okay. So there's so many things I could say. I would say if you're a runner, go in for an appointment, because there's so many concepts that you can like talk about, and you would have to get your running analyzed a little bit just to see what you're doing. But again, if you're going to take anything away, just breathe properly. Try to take nice, big, even breaths. Don't grip your abs when you're running. That's another big thing people do, especially females. We try to hold everything in. So if you can just let everything be a little bit more relaxed and allow yourself to have those nice full breaths, then that's going to kind of put you in a good position.
Yeah, that's always a tough one because running involves so many moving parts.
It's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, I know as a hockey player, I started with just standing and activating, and then standing on one leg, and then standing and kind of toe tapping or lunging to the side, and started to work on that. So,
yeah. And
sorry,
everyone's running strategy and the way they run is so different. So it's hard to say, because I don't know exactly how you run. So it's hard to say things I would change about running specifically, because it's very individually based.
Right. So we have tons of questions coming in here. Some people are just asking if you can review the process of the breath in and exhaling and when to move.
Right. So usually on the movement that creates the most exertion is when you want to exhale. So again, I always go to bench press as an example. I'm going to go over the core one in a second, but as you pull down, right, you let the bar come down on your inhale, the push is hard, right? So you want to exhale on the push. And then for your core, say, let's go to the bridge pose. You are flat on the ground. You take a nice big deep breath in, exhale. That's when you engage your pelvic floor. Think about that piston, right? We're exhaling, engaging our pelvic floor and lifting our hips. Does that cover that?
Let's see. We have a question here about what if you have pain in your back while doing crunches in a plank?
In general, or when there's, like when we were doing these questions?
Let's see if Maria gives us a little bit more on that one.
If it's just in general,
Mm-hmm.
It could be that you're gripping your abs and you're holding your breath and you're not releasing that pressure, and that pressure is going into your back. Or it could mean that you're doing an exercise that's a bit too difficult for you at the time, right? So you either need to modify the exercise and make it a little bit easier on you. I think sometimes it's difficult for us to want to modify things because we want to make it as hard as we possibly can, but just be honest with yourself, right? If you need to, modify the exercise and just try those tips of really just like increasing your breath and making sure that you're releasing that pressure, because that pressure can go elsewhere and create pain, right? So just take those tips and see if that makes it any better, but definitely modification is a big one as well.
That's a great answer. And one last question. When we're engaging our transverse abdominis or our TAs, does our pelvic floor muscle, or do our pelvic floor muscles engage voluntarily or involuntarily?
So it's a little bit of like an involuntary contraction, but it doesn't necessarily, just because you're engaging your abs doesn't necessarily mean that your pelvic floor is engaging, right? So you kind of have to get both going. So you have to engage your pelvic floor to get that abdominal contraction. But when we engage our pelvic floor, our TA engages by itself, right? So it doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily like a voluntary thing, right? Our pelvic floor is doing the work, and then our